Montana sells you the dream of wide open space and freedom. It never tells you how easy it is to disappear in it. 10 people, 10 corners of this state. None of them ever made it home. Get your map out, lock your doors, let's get into it. If you're new here, subscribe. New cases drop every week. June 25, 1983. Mauping Creek Campground, Clancy, Montana. Deep inside the Elkhorn Mountains on the western edge of Helena National Forest, a ham radio club has gathered for a Saturday family picnic. It's mid-afternoon, warm and clear. The sky above the Elkhorns is that particular shade of blue you only get at elevation. Deep, enormous, like the atmosphere itself has more room up here than anywhere else. Pine trees press in close around the campground on every side. A beaver dam creek runs along the edge of the site, cold and shallow, threading through the brush in that slow, deliberate way mountain creeks move when they're not in a hurry. Children are playing near the water. Adults are set up at folding tables with food and radio equipment crackling softly in the background, doing what families do on a Saturday in June when the weather cooperates and nowhere else needs to be. This is not a remote wilderness expedition. There are no posted warnings, no treacherous terrain the group has been briefed on, no reason for heightened vigilance. This is a family picnic in a designated campground, surrounded by people who know each other, on an ordinary summer afternoon in the mountains of western Montana. Nobody came here expecting anything to go wrong. Nyleen K. Marshall is 4 years old. Brown hair, blue eyes, 2 small dimples pressed into her cheeks, the kind that make a child's smile land differently than other smiles. A tiny mole sitting just above her left eyebrow, a detail her family will repeat to investigators, to journalists, to tip hotlines, to anyone who will listen, for the next 4 decades. She is playful and curious and full of energy, the kind of child who gravitates toward anything that moves, crawls, hides under rocks, or lives near water. Her family is here with her. Her whole world on this particular afternoon fits neatly inside this campground. She is weeks away from turning 5 years old. By every account from everyone who knew her, she was exactly the kind of child who made every space she occupied feel more alive. The children drift toward the creek, the way children always do when there is a creek nearby, and nobody is actively stopping them. They are catching frogs near the beaver dams, laughing, splashing, getting their shoes wet, doing exactly what kids do near cold mountain water on a warm afternoon when adults are distracted by food and conversation. At some point during the afternoon, Nyleen separates slightly from the group. She's sitting by the beaver dams alone, watching the water. That by itself is not alarming. She's still close, still audible. The campground is full of families, and the adults believe the margin of safety is adequate. Nothing about the afternoon has signaled otherwise. There is no particular moment of alarm, no sound, no disturbance. Just children playing near a creek on a summer afternoon. The other children come back from the creek a few minutes later. Nyleen does not come back. Here's the critical detail, and it is the one that has never been satisfactorily explained in 40 years. The window between the last confirmed sighting of Nyleen and the moment her absence was noticed is measured in minutes. Not a long, distracted afternoon, not hours of gradual drifting, minutes. And yet, when the search begins, immediately, urgently, with adults spreading into the trees within moments of realizing she was gone, she is simply not there. Dense Elkhorn mountain forest surrounds that campground on every side. Thick undergrowth, uneven terrain, old mine shafts punched into hillsides that have never been fully mapped, beaver dam channels and root networks threading through the brush at every angle. No cell signal out here. The terrain is genuinely difficult for adults to move through at speed, let alone track a small child across. A 4-year-old, moving at a 4-year-old's pace, should not have been capable of covering enough ground to vanish completely in the time available. The math does not resolve no matter how many times you run it. Search teams arrive and deploy quickly. Tracking dogs are brought in. They pick up a scent and follow it, and then lose it within a short distance. No explanation for why the trail ends where it ends. No obstacle the handlers can identify. The scent simply stops, as if whatever they were following ceased to exist at a specific point in the forest. The mine shafts in the surrounding area are searched one by one. The beaver dams are physically drained. A multi-agency operation expands into the mountain terrain and covers it systematically, sector by sector. And then, hours into the effort, the weather shifts. Rain moves across the Elkhorns and comes down on Maupin Creek, washing over the ground, soaking the undergrowth, dissolving whatever trace evidence might have kept the dogs oriented and the searchers focused. By the time the search pauses for the day, they have found nothing. No article of clothing snagged on brush, no small shoe, no impression in the mud, no sound, no sign of Nylene in any direction from the beaver dam where she was last seen. The forest absorbed her and gave nothing back. This is where it stops being a tragic accident and starts becoming something that resists simple categorization. Days after the disappearance, a child witness comes forward with an account that investigators take seriously enough to document and preserve in the official case file. According to this witness, and this is labeled an unconfirmed witness account, that designation matters here. A man in a purple jogging suit had stepped out from behind a tree near the Beaver Dam area just before Nylene vanished. The witness places him at the edge of the forest, in close proximity to where the children had been playing. Hold that image for a moment. A man in a jogging suit, alone, in a remote mountain campground on a Saturday afternoon. Not on a marked trail, not at a picnic table, not part of any group. Stepping out from behind a tree while families were gathered 50 yards away. Who does that? The Elkhorn Mountains are not a jogging destination. The campground at Maupin Creek is not a place you end up by accident. The witness account was never confirmed, never produced a named suspect, and was never formally disproven. It remained in the case file unexplained, the way certain details in certain cases just sit there and refuse to be rationalized away. Jefferson County Sheriff's Office currently holds 4 boxes of case files on Nylene K. Marshall. The case has never been closed. Now here is where the story develops a second layer, and it is a layer that has genuinely haunted this investigation for decades. Approximately 2 years after Nylene disappeared from that campground, an anonymous man began making contact with Child Find of America. He sent letters. He made phone calls. In these communications, he claimed to have personally picked Kay up on the road in the Elkhorn Park area and said she was alive, traveling the country with him. He described her physical development in specific detail. Her current height, changes to her teeth consistent with normal childhood development, the fact that her hair had been cut short and had grown in curly. These were not throwaway vague claims designed to generate attention. These were the kind of chronologically coherent, physically specific details that either come from direct access to the child or from an extraordinarily sustained and deliberate effort to construct a credible fiction over years. The FBI traced the calls to payphone booths in Madison, Wisconsin. Agents identified the specific locations. And in June of 1986, exactly 3 years to the month after Nylene disappeared from that campground, the calls stopped. The booths had been identified, and the man knew it. He never contacted Child Find of America again. He was never identified, never located. He stepped back into the same silence that had swallowed Nylene at the Beaver Dam, and he has never been accounted for. Think through what either possibility means. If those calls were entirely fabricated, someone tracked this specific case with enough sustained attention over 3 years to construct detailed, age-appropriate physical descriptions of a missing child's development, and then stopped the moment law enforcement got close to the source. That is not a casual hoax. That is a calculated, long-running operation with a deliberate endpoint. If those calls contained any actual truth, then a 4-year-old girl was taken from a public campground in Montana in the middle of a family gathering, kept alive for at least 3 years, and moved across the country while her family and federal investigators searched mine shafts and got nowhere. There is no comfortable third option here. The case continued to generate strange data in the years that followed. In 1991, a man confessed to killing Nylene. He named a specific mine shaft and claimed to know the location of her remains. Investigators searched it. Nothing was found. The man later admitted he had fabricated the entire confession. No one has ever established a satisfying explanation for why someone would do that. In 1997, 14 years after the picnic at Mauping Creek, a 19-year-old woman arrived at a hospital in New Orleans in labor. She told staff that she believed her mother's name had been Nylene. She said she had grown up outside the United States. She had no accent consistent with that claim. A couple accompanying her fled the hospital when staff began pressing for more information. DNA was obtained and tested against the Marshall family profile. It did not match. The impossibility at the center of this case has never been resolved. A 4-year-old child, in the minutes it took other children to walk back from a creek, moved far enough into dense mountain forests that trained tracking dogs could not hold the trail. Multi-agency searchers could not find a trace, and no physical evidence of any kind has surfaced in the 4 decades since. No remains, no clothing, no item of any description. The rain came hours after the disappearance. The scent should have been holdable. The terrain was searched multiple times, systematically. The mine shafts were drained. The answers were not there. There is one more piece that belongs at the edge of this case. In 1995, 12 years after the campground, Nylene's mother was murdered in Mexico, officially unrelated to the disappearance. A separate and devastating tragedy in a family that had already been defined by an unanswerable loss. There is no frame wide enough to hold all of it at once, and there is no version of the story that ends cleanly. Nylene K. Marshall would be 47 years old today. Jefferson County Sheriff's Office still accepts tips. The case remains open. Somewhere in those 4 boxes of files is a witness account about a man in a purple jogging suit stepping out from behind a tree. A detail that has never been explained, in a case that has never produced a single confirmed answer in 4 decades. A child vanished from a family picnic in broad daylight. The next case starts with a priest walking out to buy bread from a local bakery, and ends with his car sitting alone on an empty country road, the interior dark with dried blood, and no body anywhere on earth to account for it. 1984. Sacred Heart Catholic Church, Ronan, Montana. The Mission Valley stretches out in every direction from this small town. Flat-bottomed, mountain-rimmed. The kind of landscape that makes you feel simultaneously exposed and contained. The Mission Mountains rise sharp and white to the east, their peaks holding snow well into spring and sometimes beyond it. The valley floor is agricultural, quiet, worked land, the kind of place where everyone knows which cars belong on which roads, which families own which fields, and a stranger's face registers immediately against the backdrop of familiar ones. Father John Kerrigan has just arrived in Ronan. He is new to this parish, new to this community, still learning which parishioners have which last names and which families sit in which pews on Sunday morning. He has been here only days. He has not had time to learn the town's rhythms or its history. He has not had time to become part of it in any meaningful way. He is, in every sense that matters, still a stranger in a place where strangers are always noticed. And he is a stranger who is about to disappear from it so completely that 40 years of active investigation, including national television coverage and a diocese-level inquiry, will produce no answer whatsoever. Not a conviction, not a named suspect, not even a theory that survives contact with all the evidence simultaneously. This is where the case begins. Not with a wilderness trail or a remote mountain campground, but with the most ordinary errand in the world. An evening trip to the local bakery. Father Kerrigan leaves Sacred Heart Church and walks into town. He speaks briefly with parishioners he barely knows, people who will later describe the conversation as unremarkable, pleasant even. A new priest being friendly and trying to get acquainted with his community. Settling into a new place the way newly assigned clergy do when they want to make a good first impression. He finishes his errand. He walks out into the Mission Valley evening, into the particular kind of quiet that small agricultural towns produce after the workday ends and the roads empty out and the mountains go dark at the edges. And from that moment forward, no one who knew him, no one connected to his life, his church, or his new assignment, ever sees Father John Kerrigan again. Here's the critical detail. He had been in Ronan for days, not weeks, not months. Days. He had not had time to accumulate enemies. He had not had time to build relationships complicated enough to generate the kind of violence the evidence would soon describe. He was a priest on a new assignment, walking to a local bakery in a small Montana town, doing exactly the kind of ordinary thing that newly arrived people do when they are trying to feel at home somewhere unfamiliar. And yet, what investigators find in the aftermath of his disappearance is not consistent with a man who wandered off a road or suffered a sudden medical event alone in the Mission Valley dark. What they find is consistent with something that required planning, presence, and intent. The physical evidence discovered after Father Kerrigan's disappearance is what moves this case from a missing persons report into a different category entirely. Bloodied clothing found along a roadside. Not a small amount. Bloodied clothing recovered in a quantity that speaks to serious violence. Not to an accident or a minor injury that might explain itself away with the right set of assumptions. Then investigators locate something else. A bloody coat hanger. That specific detail has stayed embedded in this case ever since it was first documented, because it is the kind of detail that resists every innocent interpretation you try to apply to it. Investigators at the time developed a hypothesis, and it is important to be precise here. This is a documented investigative hypothesis, not a confirmed forensic conclusion, that the coat hanger may have been used as a restraint device. A restraint is not a spontaneous act. A restraint is not what you produce in a moment of unplanned, panicked violence on a dark road. A restraint is something you bring with you, or something you apply deliberately because you have already decided, before the encounter begins, that you are going to need it. The difference between impulsive violence and premeditated violence is enormous in how it reflects on whoever committed it. And that coat hanger sits firmly on the premeditated side of that line. And then there is the car. Father Kerrigan's vehicle is located on a country road outside Ronan. The interior is described in the investigative record as splashed with a great deal of blood. That phrase is not forensic precision or careful medical hedging. It is the language of someone standing beside a vehicle on an empty Mission Valley road at night, trying to convey the scale of what they are looking at to the people who will come after them. Enough blood that investigators knew immediately they were not looking for someone who had stepped out to clear his head or deal with a minor roadside problem. They were looking for a body. They searched. They followed leads. They expanded the investigation in every direction the evidence suggested. They never found one. This is where it stops making sense, regardless of which direction you approach it from. A priest who had been in town for days. Physical evidence describing serious and apparently premeditated violence. A potential restraint device which requires forethought. Deployed against a man who had been in the community for less than a week. Planning requires prior knowledge of a specific target. But Father Kerrigan was new. He had barely unpacked. He had barely learned the names of the families in his parish. Who in Ronan, Montana in 1984 had the specific prior knowledge of this particular man that planning against him would require? And what had he done to generate that knowledge in so little time? The gap between the brevity of his presence and the apparent deliberateness of what happened to him is a contradiction that this investigation has never bridged. It remains the central unanswered question of the case, and it has never had an answer that holds up under pressure. The investigation expanded its reach across the country. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, one of the most watched true crime programs in American television history, with millions of viewers and a functioning tip line that had generated actionable leads on hundreds of other cold cases during its run. For Father Kerrigan, the national exposure produced nothing usable. No suspects were publicly named. No arrests were ever made. No tips cracked the case open. Cases with this volume of physical evidence, bloodied clothing, a documented potential restraint, a vehicle interior described as heavily bloodied, almost always surface something in the investigative process. A witness who saw something and was too afraid to come forward at the time. A piece of secondary evidence that connects to a person or a place investigators hadn't considered. A tip from someone on the periphery who finally decides to talk years later. This case produced none of that. The national spotlight fell on it and found nothing to illuminate. The silence has held for 4 decades. Now this is where the case develops a dimension that changes the frame without answering a single thing. In 2015, more than 30 years after Father Kerrigan walked out of that bakery and into the Mission Valley evening, the diocese opened an investigation into historical sexual misconduct allegations connected to his name. The specifics of those allegations have not been fully detailed in public reporting. Kerrigan was never charged, never convicted, never formally adjudicated in any legal proceeding. He was gone before any formal process could reach him. But the existence of that posthumous investigation places a question inside the original 1984 case that could not have been anticipated at the time and cannot now be removed. Did someone know something about Father Kerrigan before he arrived in Ronan? Not a rumor quietly circulating in the community he had just entered. Prior knowledge, specific, serious, actionable knowledge. the kind that would generate a motive targeted enough and intense enough to produce premeditated violence against a man who had been in town for only days. That cannot be stated as established fact. No connection between the misconduct investigation and the 1984 disappearance has ever been formally confirmed by investigators or prosecutors. The identity of any perpetrator remains entirely unknown. But the question is now permanently embedded in this case. If someone had knowledge of Kerrigan that preceded his arrival in the Mission Valley, knowledge that followed him from a previous assignment in a different town, a different community, a different diocese, then the timeline problem that makes this case so disorienting begins to soften slightly. A man who had been in Ronan for days might still have had someone waiting for him who already knew exactly why they were there and what they were prepared to do about it. But here is what does not resolve even within that framework. The body. A car interior described as containing a great deal of blood. Bloodied clothing recovered along a roadside. These are not the signatures of a controlled, clean, careful operation. This was violent and messy. And yet, Father John Kerrigan has never been found. No remains, no secondary scene, no grave located in 4 decades. The Mission Valley is not remote mountain wilderness where a body can disappear into unmapped terrain and remain unrecoverable for generations. The roads outside Ronan run through open agricultural land. If a body were left in that terrain, recovery should have been possible. If it was moved, transported, and concealed as part of a plan that extended deliberately past the act of violence, that implies an operational capacity well beyond a spontaneous roadside confrontation. Whoever is responsible either achieved a concealment in open terrain that is held without a single crack for 40 years, or they had planning and resources that have never been traced. No arrests. No named suspects in any public record. No closure for the community, the church, or the case file that still sits open somewhere in Montana. The car, the clothing, the coat hanger. 3 pieces of physical evidence, each one pointing toward premeditated violence, none of them leading anywhere after 40 years. What stays with you is the coat hanger, not the blood in the car. That is the record of violence already completed by the time investigators arrived. The coat hanger, if the investigative hypothesis holds, is the record of violence anticipated, something brought or applied deliberately in a situation specific enough to require it, against a man the perpetrator had clearly thought about in advance. That is a different kind of act from an impulsive confrontation on a dark country road. And it was directed at a man who had been in Ronan, Montana for less than a week. He had barely had time to learn which way to walk to the bakery. His car sat on that Mission Valley road with the interior dark and nobody inside it. 40 years later, no one has answered for it. A priest with blood in his car and no body anywhere on earth to account for it. The next case is different in almost every way, except for the ending. A woman crashes her car on a desolate 2-lane highway in eastern Montana, climbs out of the wreckage, stares straight through the other driver like she is not standing there, climbs a fence, and walks into the dark. And after that, nothing. April 20th, 1989. Highway 200, eastern Montana. The flatlands out here are a different kind of Montana than the mountains to the west. No dramatic peaks pressing against the sky, no dense forest closing in on both sides of the road. Out here it is open in a way that feels almost aggressive about it. The horizon sits miles away in every direction. The 2-lane highway runs straight through country that belongs to ranchers and river systems and very little else. The Missouri and Yellowstone River drainages spread through this part of the state in wide, shallow braids. And the land between the water and the road is just more land. Flat, dry, immense, belonging to nobody who isn't prepared to work very hard for it. The towns are small and spaced far apart, and the stretches of road between them go long enough that the silence starts to feel like its own kind of presence. At 8:15 in the evening, the light is going fast, and the highway through Macomb County near Circle, Montana, is the kind of empty that makes you feel like the only person left in a very large world. This is where Patricia Meehan's story ends. And this is also, in a way that has never been fully untangled, where it begins to fracture into something no investigator or family member has ever been able to explain. Patricia Meehan is 37 years old. Strawberry blonde hair, green eyes, freckles across her face. A quiet voice that the people who knew her describe as almost a whisper. The kind of voice that makes you lean in slightly to hear what she is saying. She is a ranch hand from Bozeman, and she loves animals the way some people love people. Deeply, practically, without needing to make it into something more complicated than it is. She is described by people who knew her as steady and private, someone whose inner life ran deeper than what she showed on the surface. She is not the kind of person anyone who knew her expected to vanish. She does not fit the profile of someone whose story ends on a remote 2-lane highway in eastern Montana with no explanation and no recovery. And yet here we are. The day before the crash, April 19th, 1989. Patricia calls her father in Pittsburgh. This detail matters immediately, and it matters deeply. She tells him she's under stress. She wants to come home. Her father listens and agrees that coming home is the right move, but only after she keeps an appointment with her psychologist first. The appointment is already set for April 21st. Patricia agrees. The plan is made. She will see her psychologist in the morning, and then she will travel home to Pittsburgh. She never makes it to that appointment. On the evening of April 20th, Patricia Meehan is driving on Highway 200 near Circle, Montana. Here is the critical detail, and it is one of the most disorienting facts in this entire case. Circle is nearly 400 miles east of Bozeman. Pittsburgh is to the east of Montana, yes, but you do not get to Pittsburgh by driving east on Highway 200 through Macomb County. That is not the route. That is not even close to the route. Patricia Meehan was 400 miles from home, driving in a direction that no logical itinerary supports, on the night before a psychologist appointment she had agreed to keep. Nobody who knew her has ever been able to explain what put her on that road. Nobody has ever accounted for the decision or the mileage or the direction. The 400-mile gap between where she should have been and where she actually was has never been closed. At approximately 8:15 in the evening, Peggy Bueller and her father are driving on Highway 200 when they are forced to swerve to avoid Patricia's car, which is drifting on the wrong side of the road. Seconds later, Patricia's vehicle strikes another car head-on, the car driven by Carol Hates. The collision is significant. Carol Hates, remarkably, escapes without injury. She gets out of her car, she looks across at the other vehicle, and she watches Patricia Meehan climb out of the wreckage. This is where it stops being a car accident and becomes something else. Carol Hates will describe what she saw in specific terms that have stayed with this case ever since. Patricia climbed out of the wrecked car and stood on the highway. She looked at Carol Hates. She stared directly at her from a short distance and showed no recognition whatsoever of what had just happened. No words, no acknowledgement of the crash, no response to another human being standing right in front of her after a head-on collision on a Montana highway in the dark. She looked straight through Carol Heights, like Carol was not there at all. And then Patricia Meehan walked to a fence along the side of the road, climbed it, stepped down into a dark field on the other side, and kept walking into the eastern Montana night. That is the last confirmed visual that anyone has of her. A woman climbing a fence in the dark in eastern Montana, walking away from a car crash without a word, without looking back, without any apparent awareness of where she was or what had just happened to her. The search begins as quickly as searchers can reach the location. The only physical trace Patricia left is a set of tennis shoe tracks pressed into the ground on the other side of that fence. Searchers follow those tracks for approximately 3/4 of a mile into the terrain. And then the tracks stop. Not because the landscape changes dramatically, not because a river or cliff or any other physical barrier interrupts the path. The tracks simply end in open ground, without an explanation for why a walking person's footprints would cease to leave impressions in the earth at that specific point. The search is suspended at 3 in the morning and resumed at first light. Nothing additional is found. Her family arrives and brings in horses and ATVs to cover the surrounding terrain. A helicopter searches from the air. 2,000 flyers are distributed across the region. The physical search produces nothing. What follows is one of the strangest chapters in Montana missing persons history. Over the months and years after Patricia's disappearance, more than 5,000 reported sightings of her flood in from across the United States. Montana, Washington, Minnesota, South Dakota, New Mexico, Alaska, Hawaii. 5,000 separate reports from people who believed they had seen a strawberry blonde woman with green eyes and freckles matching Patricia's description. Her parents personally followed up on the sightings that seemed most credible. Those where witnesses described a strong resemblance in compelling detail. None were confirmed as Patricia. Every lead dissolved on contact. She was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, a face distributed across the continental United States and beyond, generating thousands of reported sightings and producing no confirmed trace of where she actually was. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, Season 2, Episode 6. The broadcast date was November 1st, 1989. That was what would have been Patricia Meehan's 38th birthday. Whether that scheduling was deliberate or a coincidence, it gives the broadcast a weight it might not otherwise have carried. The national coverage generated tips and generated attention and produced none of the answers it was meant to surface. Now this is where the case turns in a specific and clinical direction. In the days before the crash, people who knew Patricia had noticed something was off. She was described as hyper, more animated than usual, more agitated, moving through her days with an energy that felt wrong in a way that was hard to name but impossible to ignore once you were paying attention. She had called her father to say she was under stress and wanted to come home. She had a relationship with a psychologist established enough that her parents made keeping that appointment a condition of her return. These are not the markers of someone in a stable baseline state. These are the markers of someone managing something that was becoming very difficult to manage. Something that was pushing against the edges of what she could contain on her own. The working theory held by most investigators who have examined this case is that Patricia experienced a serious psychological episode, a dissociative break, a mental health crisis of some kind. In the hours surrounding the crash on Highway 200, the behavior Carol Heights witnessed at the crash site is consistent with that interpretation in a way it is not consistent with much else. A person in a dissociative state does not necessarily perceive danger the way someone operating in ordinary consciousness does. They do not necessarily register cold or distance, or the fact that it is dark and they are alone in the middle of open terrain in eastern Montana, with no shelter and no clear direction. The fence climbing, the silence, the complete absence of response to Carroll Heights. These behaviors fit the framework of a serious dissociative episode in a way that ordinary post-collision shock does not. But here is what doesn't make sense even within that framework. The 400 miles. A dissociative episode does not explain how Patricia came to be on Highway 200 near Circle in the first place. Someone drove that car east for 400 miles across Montana before the crash. Someone made turns, passed through towns, covered enormous distance in a direction that makes no sense relative to either her home in Bozeman or her stated destination in Pittsburgh. If Patricia was already in a dissociative or crisis state when she got in the car on April 20th, how did she drive 400 miles without incident until that stretch of Highway 200? And if she was not yet in crisis when she started driving, what happened during those 400 miles that produced the state Carroll Heights witnessed when she climbed out of the wreckage? Neither version of that timeline resolves cleanly, no matter how long you hold it up to the light. There is one more piece that belongs at the edge of this case. After Patricia disappeared, investigators developed the film from her camera. A camera she had with her, a camera she had clearly been using in the period before everything fell apart. Inside the developed roll was a self-portrait. Patricia, alone, photographed in a mirror, taken sometime before the crash. She had pointed the lens at herself and pressed the shutter. Nobody knows exactly when it was taken or what circumstances surrounded it. Nobody knows what she was thinking in that moment. But the image exists. A woman who is about to disappear from a highway in eastern Montana, having photographed her own face alone in a mirror before everything came apart around her. Hit subscribe if you want to go deeper on cases like this. New ones every week. Patricia Meehan's shoe tracks end 3/4 of a mile into that field and offer no explanation for what happened next. Her case remains open. The 5,000 sightings produced nothing. The self-portrait sits in the case file. And a 400-mile drive in the wrong direction across Montana has never been explained by anyone in any investigative framework. In the 35 years since she climbed that fence and walked into the eastern Montana dark, a woman walked into a Montana field in 1989 and was reportedly seen everywhere after that, except where she actually was. Next, a 10-year-old boy sets out for school on a February morning in Great Falls and takes one turn into a residential alley. He never comes out the other side. February 6th, 1996. Great Falls, Montana. 7:30 in the morning. The 400 block of 4th Avenue North, a residential neighborhood of older homes, wide alleys, and the particular quiet of a cold winter weekday before the city fully wakes up. Great Falls sits in the center of the state on the Missouri River, a working city with a military base and a grid of streets that feels more Midwestern than most of Montana. The neighborhood around Whittier Elementary School is the kind of place where kids walk to school because that is what kids do. Because the streets are familiar, the distance is short, and the route is the same every single morning. It is a neighborhood built on routine, on repetition, on the kind of familiarity that makes parents feel comfortable letting their kids make the walk alone. Zachary Ramsey has walked this route before. He knows the alley. He knows the school. He knows the kids he is going to see when he gets there. And he knows the teachers. And he knows the exact number of blocks between his door and the front entrance of the school because he has covered them enough times that the distance has stopped being something he thinks about. On a cold Tuesday morning in February, he puts on his jersey, steps out the door, and sets off on a walk he has made dozens of times without incident. Zachary Ramsey is 10 years old. Biracial, with brown hair and brown eyes, and dimples that everyone who knew him mentions when they describe him. The kind of dimples that make a face immediately recognizable in a photograph, that show up in every school picture and stay in people's memory long after the other details have faded. A small scar sits between his eyebrows. He is the best drawer in his class, the kid other kids approach because his drawings actually look like what they are supposed to be. Because he has a talent that shows up early and clearly in people who are going to carry it their whole lives. He is a fast runner. He is, by every account from teachers, family, and the kids who knew him at Whittier Elementary, fully present in the world. Engaged, known, loved in the specific way that a child is loved, when they are the kind of person who makes every room they walk into slightly more alive, without trying to. On the morning of February 6th, he is wearing his blue football jersey with the gold number 45 on it, his own name across the back. It is the kind of jersey a kid wears because it makes him feel like something specific and good about himself. He puts it on, steps out into the cold Great Falls morning, and begins the short walk to Whittier Elementary School. He leaves at approximately 7:30 in the morning. The walk to school is a matter of blocks through a residential neighborhood he has navigated countless times. The route takes him through an alley in the 400 block of 4th Avenue North. A cut-through that makes the walk a little shorter, a passage that has always felt ordinary and safe, because it has always been ordinary and safe. The morning is cold, but it is not empty. A family of 3 witnesses Zachary moving through the alley. They also witness something that stays with them. A near miss between Zachary and an off-white 4-door car also moving through the alley at the same time. The car comes close enough to the boy that it registers as alarming to the family watching from nearby. Additional witnesses in the area report seeing Zachary at various points along the route, standing in the alley as if paused, waiting for something or someone, before moving again at a pace consistent with a kid walking to school on a Tuesday morning. At 7:45 in the morning, Zachary is last confirmed crossing North 6th Street, 1 block from Whittier Elementary. He never arrives. He is simply not there when the school doors open and the school day begins, and no one who is along the route that morning can account for what happened in that final block. Here is the critical detail. 1 block, 1 city block between the last confirmed sighting of Zachary Ramsey and the front door of his school. This was not a remote trailhead or a desolate Montana highway or a mountain campground surrounded by dense wilderness. This was a residential neighborhood in a Montana city on a Tuesday morning in February, with families and kids moving through it in the ordinary business of a school day. The margin between Zachary's last confirmed location and his destination is a single familiar stretch of sidewalk and street. And in that single block, on that ordinary Tuesday morning, he stopped existing in any traceable form. No item of clothing recovered, no physical trace, no secondary witness to what happened in the space between North 6th Street and the front door of the school he was walking toward. Whatever happened in that block happened without leaving anything behind. Now this is where the case turns in a direction that investigators have never been able to fully confirm and have never been able to fully walk away from. Nathaniel Bar Jonah. By February of 1996, he is not unknown to law enforcement. He carries a documented history stretching across multiple states: Connecticut, Massachusetts, Wyoming. that includes convictions and arrests for predatory conduct against children. A history significant enough that his name is already in systems and his patterns are already known to people who track that kind of record. He is living in Great Falls in the winter of 1996. And on the morning of February 6th, witness accounts place him standing beside a dumpster in the alley on 4th Avenue North at approximately 7:15 in the morning. In position before Zachary enters the alley, already there, already present in that specific location on that specific morning. He is wearing a blue jacket that witnesses describe as resembling a police uniform. Those same witnesses report that Bar Jonah was still in that position beside the dumpster when Zachary walked through the alley minutes later. A documented predator with a multi-state history of crimes against children, wearing a police-style jacket, in the exact alley Zachary Ramsey used to walk to school. On the exact morning Zachary Ramsey vanished. That is what the confirmed witness record contains. Think about what the jacket represents in this specific context. A 10-year-old child walking alone to school on a cold February morning in a residential neighborhood. A man standing near a dumpster in an alley ahead of him, wearing something that looks like law enforcement. Children are taught, consistently and from an early age, to trust police. A jacket that resembles a uniform creates a very specific and automatic response in a child that a plain jacket does not generate. Whether that jacket was worn deliberately to exploit that response or was coincidental to the morning has never been established in a legal proceeding. But it is a detail that sits inside this case and does not soften with time or with repeated examination. It has been in the case file for nearly 30 years, and it has never been explained away. The investigation that follows is extensive and sustained. Investigators gather the witness accounts, reconstruct the timeline from the family of 3 and the additional witnesses along the route, and work toward Bar Jonah as the primary person of interest. The case becomes, over the following years, one of the most closely watched missing persons investigations in Montana. And then it runs into a wall that comes from the most painful and human direction imaginable. Zachary's mother, Rachel Howard, is a woman of deep faith. She holds on to the belief, through the months of investigation, through the accumulation of investigative evidence, through everything the assembled picture is suggesting, that her son is still alive somewhere and that he will come home. In 2002, as investigators are building toward murder and kidnapping charges against Bar Jonah, they meet with Rachel Howard as part of that process. She tells them, directly and sincerely, that she believes Zachary is still alive. Under Montana law, a mother's stated belief that her child was living created a barrier to pursuing a murder charge without a recovered body. The charges are not filed. The decision, made by a mother whose love did not know another shape, who could not let go of what she needed to be true, may be the reason that no one was ever convicted of anything directly connected to Zachary's disappearance. It is the most heartbreaking legal detail in a case built from heartbreaking details, and it has no clean resolution in any direction. Bar Jonah does not walk free. In 2002, he is convicted on separate charges of kidnapping and sexual assault involving 3 other boys in Great Falls. He receives a sentence of 130 years in Montana State Prison. Investigators believe he was also connected to incidents in Connecticut in 1973, Massachusetts in 1978, and Wyoming in 1997. A pattern of predatory conduct extending across 3 decades and multiple states, touching victims whose names are spread across the country. He dies in Montana State Prison in 2008. he never provides any information about Zachary Ramsey. Whatever he knew, whatever happened in that alley between 7:30 and 7:45 on the morning of February 6, 1996, he carried with him to his death, and it ended there, permanently unreachable. But here is what doesn't make sense, or rather, what makes the specific, uncomfortable sense that the legal system was never able to act on completely. Documented predator was physically present in the exact alley at the exact time Zachary walked through it. He was wearing clothing suited to generating trust in a child. The near miss with the off-white car in the same alley at approximately the same time creates a secondary element that has never been fully resolved. Whether that vehicle was connected to Bar Jonah's presence that morning or was an unrelated coincidence has never been established. No body has ever been found. No secondary scene identified. No physical evidence connecting Bar Jonah directly to Zachary was recovered in a form that survived legal scrutiny in the absence of a murder charge. The case sits, officially, as endangered missing. A classification that keeps the file open and active, but cannot say what most investigators believe happened in that alley on a February morning in 1996. Zachary Ramsey would be nearly 40 years old today. The alley in the 400 block of 4th Avenue North still exists in Great Falls. Whittier Elementary is still 1 block away from the corner where a 10-year-old boy in a blue football jersey with the number 45 and his own name on the back was last seen crossing the street. His blue jersey has never been found. His body has never been found. The case has never been formally closed. And the man investigators believe was responsible died in a Montana prison in 2008. 16 years after the morning in question, leaving every answer locked inside a silence that cannot now be broken. A predator died in Montana State Prison with the answer, and the answer died with him. The next case leaves the city entirely. No alleys, no schools, no residential streets. An experienced survivalist with thousands of miles of wilderness hiking behind him walks into Glacier National Park in November, when the trails are icing over and the park is nearly empty. 7 months later, a park ranger discovers an abandoned backcountry camp sitting frozen and untouched in the snow. The man who made it is never found. November 2nd, 2000. Glacier National Park, Montana. The off-season has emptied the park of almost everyone. The summer crowds are long gone. The RVs, the day hikers, the families with children who stop at every pullout to take photographs of the same mountains from the same angles because those mountains demand it. What is left in early November is the park itself, stripped of the human presence that softens it from June through September. Returned to what it actually is underneath the tourism infrastructure. One of the most rugged and unforgiving landscapes in North America. The trails are beginning to ice over. The temperatures drop fast after dark and stay down longer than you expect. The backcountry in early November requires a different kind of calculation than it does in July. And the margin for error narrows considerably once the season turns and the maintained trail infrastructure closes down for winter. The ranger stations that provide a safety net in summer are shuttered or staffed at a fraction of their warm season capacity. The park is not empty exactly, but it is close. And the difference between summer glacier and November glacier is the difference between a landscape that tolerates you and a landscape that simply does not care whether you make it out or not. Most people who understand Glacier stay out of its backcountry in early November. Most people, however, do not have Patrick Whalen's resume. Patrick Whalen is 33 years old, a registered nurse from Portland, Oregon, who is in the process of pursuing a degree in naturopathic medicine. He is not a casual outdoorsman. He is not someone who picks up hiking on weekends and decides one day to try a national park. He has hiked thousands of miles on the Pacific Crest Trail, one of the most demanding long-distance hiking routes in the country. A trail that filters out people who are not genuinely prepared for what extended wilderness demands of the body and the mind and the judgment. He has logged hundreds of hours across multiple national parks over years of serious engagement with backcountry environments. He has, in the language of people who take this seriously, a track record that speaks for itself. He is the kind of person whose presence in glacier backcountry in November reads as calculated and deliberate risk, not recklessness. Because he has the accumulated experience to make that calculation in a way that most people cannot. He knows what he is walking into. He has walked into environments like this before and come out the other side. That history is exactly what makes this case so difficult to explain when you hold the evidence up next to it. In the weeks leading up to November 2nd, Waylon has been frequenting the glacier area in a pattern that everyone who sees him registers, but nobody questions at the time. He has been on Blackfeet tribal lands adjacent to the park's eastern boundary. He has been in the Columbia Falls area on the park's western side. He has been coming and going from the glacier corridor for weeks, moving through both sides of the park and the surrounding landscape in a rhythm that reads as purposeful, but that nobody has ever been able to attach a specific purpose to. What he was doing during those weeks, and what was drawing him back to this particular landscape with such consistent regularity, has never been established. The Charlie Project notes his extended presence in the area in the weeks before his disappearance without being able to explain it. He was here. He kept coming back. Nobody who interacted with him during that period has provided an explanation that investigators have confirmed, and Waylon himself never told anyone why. That sustained, unexplained presence in the glacier corridor in the weeks before he vanished is one of the genuinely unresolved elements of this case. It cannot be made to fit neatly into either the accidental death framework or the voluntary disappearance framework, and it sits outside both without resolution. On November 2nd, Patrick Waylon is last seen near Lake McDonald Lodge on the western side of the park. His vehicle is located near the Highway 89 and Highway 49 junction at Glacier's eastern edge, near the boundary with the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. That detail is its own quiet impossibility. Lake McDonald Lodge is on the western side of Glacier, and the vehicle is found on the eastern side near Highway 89. The distance between those 2 points through the park is significant, and the Going to the Sun Road, the main cross-park corridor, typically closes for winter by late October. If the sighting near Lake McDonald Lodge is accurate and the vehicle location is accurate, Waylon moved across a large section of a national park in early November, alone, without a maintained road available, and ended up on the eastern boundary without anyone who has come forward being able to account for how or why. His vehicle sits at the junction. Patrick Waylon is not in it and is not found anywhere near it. The search that follows is extensive. Glacier's backcountry is covered as thoroughly as November conditions allow. Searchers move through terrain that is already becoming genuinely difficult in the early winter, following every lead and every reasonable projection of where an experienced man might have gone from the vehicle's location. Nothing is found, no gear, no trace of him in any direction, no indication of which direction Waylon moved from the highway junction. The search is suspended without result, and the case enters a silence that lasts 7 months. Here is the critical detail, and it is the one that gives this case its particular and lasting weight. On May 27, 2001, 7 months after Patrick Whalen's last confirmed sighting near Lake McDonald Lodge, a park ranger discovers an abandoned backcountry camp at Atlantic Creek Campground along the North Fork of Cutbank Creek. 7 months. Through a Montana winter, through snowpack and freeze and thaw, through spring melt, this camp sat in the eastern backcountry of Glacier, with no one at it and no one coming to check on it. This is in remote terrain, far from the main visitor corridors, country that requires genuine wilderness navigation to reach. The camp is believed to be Whalen's. Tent poles, gear, a fire ring, the physical evidence of a sustained backcountry presence. Not a single overnight stop, not a quick emergency shelter constructed in a moment of need, but a camp that someone built with intention and used over a period of time, and then either walked away from or was no longer able to leave. No human remains are found at the camp or anywhere in its immediate vicinity. The gear is there. The structure of the camp is there. Patrick Whalen is not there and has not been found anywhere in the 24 years since. This is where it stops being a straightforward wilderness disappearance and becomes something that experienced backcountry investigators have struggled to categorize cleanly. Think through the timeline carefully. Whalen disappears November 2nd. His vehicle is on Glacier's eastern boundary. His camp is found 7 months later in the eastern backcountry at Atlantic Creek. The camp shows evidence of sustained use, not a single night's shelter, but a camp someone inhabited over time. Which means one of two things must have happened. Either Whalen established or returned to that camp after November 2nd, meaning he survived in Glacier's backcountry through the early Montana winter, maintaining a camp through conditions that are severe even for experienced outdoors people, before something happened to him at some undetermined point. Or the camp was already established before his November 2nd disappearance, representing part of what he had been doing in the area during those weeks of repeated visits that nobody could explain. Neither version resolves cleanly. Both leave gaps the physical evidence at the camp cannot fill. A 7-month window between a man's last confirmed sighting and the discovery of his inhabited camp is not a gap that produces easy answers. Then there is the question of what happened beyond the camp. The gear is present. The fire ring is present. Whalen is not. In Glacier's eastern backcountry, where wildlife is abundant and weather is severe through the winter months, human remains do not always survive in recoverable form. Exposure, predation, and terrain all complicate recovery. But gear survives. Equipment survives. The gear was at that camp in a state consistent with someone having used it and then departed or been unable to depart. There is no secondary evidence trail leading away from Atlantic Creek in any direction that investigators were able to follow. The camp simply ends, and beyond it, the eastern backcountry of Glacier National Park offers nothing back. The Charlie Project flags his case as unclear with respect to voluntary disappearance, meaning investigators have never been able to fully rule out the possibility that Whalen chose to walk away from his life in Portland and disappear into the wilderness deliberately. He had been in the area for weeks with no clearly stated purpose. He had been on Blackfeet tribal lands. He had been moving between the eastern and western sides of the park in a pattern that suggests active and intentional engagement with the landscape rather than casual tourism. No note was found. No communication in the weeks before his disappearance suggested he was in distress or making plans to leave his life behind. The voluntary disappearance theory rests entirely on the behavioral pattern of those weeks, not on any direct evidence pointing in that direction. And it remains a clearly labeled theory alongside the more commonly held one of accidental death in backcountry terrain, with remains that have never been located. What is confirmed? A man with thousands of Pacific Crest Trail miles behind him and a sustained unexplained presence in the glacier area in the weeks before he vanished, entered the park in November and left behind a camp in the eastern backcountry that sat undisturbed for 7 months before anyone found it. His vehicle was on the highway boundary. His camp was in the interior. No remains have ever been located. The distance between those two data points, the car on the highway and the camp in the backcountry, has never been satisfactorily filled in, and the weeks of unexplained repeated visits to the area before November 2nd have never been explained by anyone who knew him or anyone who encountered him during that time. Those weeks remain a blank that no investigative framework has been able to write anything conclusive into. The camp at Atlantic Creek is everything Patrick Whalen left behind in Glacier National Park. Tent poles and a fire ring and a 7-month silence. A vehicle on the eastern boundary and no account of what happened in between. The park absorbed him completely and has offered nothing back in the 24 years since his last confirmed sighting near Lake McDonald Lodge. If you're new here, subscribe. New cases every week, and they don't get any easier than this one. An experienced survivalist's camp sat frozen in glacier for 7 months, and the park gave nothing else back. The next case moves southeast to the Crazy Mountains, a geological anomaly that rises abruptly from the Montana plains, where a former search and rescue team member with GPS equipment and pre-positioned supply caches sets out alone on a short retrieval trip and walks 15 miles in the wrong direction. September 3rd, 2014, Cottonwood Lake Trailhead, Crazy Mountains, Montana. Park County and Sweetgrass County share this range between them, and the Crazy Mountains share almost nothing with anything else in Montana geography. They are a geological anomaly, an isolated cluster of peaks that rises abruptly and dramatically from the surrounding Great Plains, visible from Interstate 90 for miles before you reach them. Close enough from the highway to look accessible and approachable, but punishing once you're actually inside them. Sheer cliffs, dense timber that closes around you without warning, rock slide fields that shift the terrain underfoot, checkerboard public and private land that creates navigational and legal complications even before the weather turns or the light fades. The Apsahalluka people historically called this range Awaksa Awapia, the ominous mountains. That name was not metaphorical. It was observational, passed down across generations by people who understood what these mountains were and what they were capable of, and who had learned to treat them with a specific kind of respect that comes from long experience rather than assumption. From the Interstate 90 corridor, they looked dramatic but reachable. Inside them, the calculation changes entirely. Aaron Hedges knows this range. He is 38 years old, a Bozeman resident who has spent significant time in the Crazy Mountains and the surrounding wilderness over the course of his adult life. He is a former member of a search and rescue team, the kind of person who goes into the mountains to find other people who have gotten into trouble, who understands firsthand how terrain and weather and disorientation interact with each other in the specific ways that produce the outcomes he has personally witnessed. He is an experienced hunter and wilderness man who has been in the crazies before, enough times and deeply enough to have pre-positioned multiple supply caches in the mountains before this hunt even begins. Those caches represent preparation, not just confidence. Supply caches are not the behavior of someone who is casual about risk. They are the behavior of someone who thinks ahead, who plans for contingencies, who takes the wilderness seriously enough to pre-stage resources for the moments when things do not go as planned. Aaron Hedges is exactly the kind of person who is supposed to be able to handle whatever the crazy mountains deliver. He is also exactly the kind of person whose disappearance inside them raises questions that do not have easy answers. He arrives at the Cottonwood Lake trailhead on September 3rd with a mule and the full equipment for an elk hunting trip. The early days of the hunt pass without significant incident. He is operating in country he is prepared for, with gear he is pre-positioned in mountains he has been in before. And then, on September 5th, something shifts. Following a mule-related equipment incident that disrupts the day's plans and separates him from part of his setup, Hedges makes the decision to set out alone to retrieve a cached supply at a nearby lake. This is not a dramatic decision in the context of his experience and preparation. This is an experienced wilderness man going to get something he already put there himself. A short, manageable task in terrain he knows. It should take a limited amount of time and present no significant challenge to someone with his background. His GPS walkie-talkie begins showing his movement almost immediately, and what it shows does not match the intended route. Hedges is moving east, towards Sweetgrass County, instead of northwest toward his supply cache. The direction is clearly wrong. His friends in the hunting party contact him over the radio. He hears them. He acknowledges the error clearly and directly. He tells them he is going to correct course and move in the right direction. That radio exchange is the last contact anyone has with Aaron Hedges. This is where it stops being normal. After that final radio call, Hedges does not return to the trailhead. He does not return to the hunting camp. He does not make contact again by any means available to him. His friends wait. And then they wait longer. And then they raise the alarm. The search that follows becomes one of the largest wilderness search and rescue operations in Montana in recent memory. 12 days of sustained effort across difficult terrain. Military helicopters equipped with infrared and night vision technology covering the aerial corridors above the range. Civilian helicopters providing additional coverage from different angles and elevations. 20 dog teams working the terrain on the ground across multiple sectors. 7 horse teams covering areas that ground searchers on foot could not access efficiently or quickly. More than 50 ground searchers moving through the crazy mountains in coordinated grid patterns, covering the terrain as completely as the checkerboard land ownership and the difficulty of the range allow. The operation is declared complete on September 22nd, 2014, after 12 days of intensive effort. Nothing is found. No Aaron Hedges. No gear. No sign. No physical indication in any direction of where he went after that final acknowledged radio call. Here is what does not make sense. And this is the first of several things in this case that genuinely resist resolution when you hold them up to the light. A former search and rescue team member, with GPS equipment actively tracking his location, acknowledged the directional error while it was still correctable. He heard his friends on the radio. He confirmed he understood he was going the wrong way. He said he would fix it. And then, after making that acknowledgement to people who heard him say it, he continued in the wrong direction and did not come back. A GPS device does not malfunction in a way that makes northwest look like east. An experienced search and rescue team member does not misread a compass in a way that cannot be corrected after being told by radio, clearly and directly, that he is off course. The gap between the acknowledgement and the disappearance has never been explained. It is the central mechanical impossibility of this case. and it has no satisfying resolution in any framework investigators have publicly advanced. The crazy mountains themselves complicate everything further. The checkerboard ownership pattern of public and private land in this range created documented operational challenges for the search effort. Searchers required legal access to private sections of terrain that could not always be obtained quickly or at all during a fast-moving operation. Portions of the eastern side of the mountains were not covered as thoroughly or as swiftly as the public land sections. Whether those coverage gaps correspond to terrain where the relevant evidence ended up is a question that later discoveries would make considerably more pointed and considerably harder to answer. In June of 2015, 9 months after the 12-day search was declared complete, a bow, a full backpack, field clothing, and a hunting license bearing Aaron Hedges' name are located on the eastern side of the Crazy Mountains. On private land, outside the permitted hunting area, miles from where the search had concentrated its resources. The items are clustered within a quarter-mile of each other, not scattered by an event that dispersed equipment violently in multiple directions, but deposited in a relatively contained area on the wrong side of the mountain range, in terrain that the search had not been able to cover comprehensively. This discovery does not close questions. It relocates the entire case. Hedges was not where the terrain and the search said he should have been. Then, in August of 2016, nearly 2 full years after the hunting trip began at Cottonwood Lake Trailhead, human remains are found approximately half a mile from the 2015 gear cluster. The remains are Aaron Hedges. He is located approximately 7 to 15 miles from his intended destination, on the eastern side of the Crazy Mountains, in the wrong county, in terrain the concentrated phase of the search did not thoroughly cover. The official cause of death is undetermined. Exposure and accident are the most commonly cited explanations in public reporting. But undetermined means the record does not foreclose other possibilities, and the circumstances of how he ended up where he did have never been publicly reconstructed in any satisfying or complete way. And then there are the boots. Aaron Hedges' boots are found sitting neatly beside his remains, not displaced, not scattered by predation or by decomposition processes or by animal activity. In the nearly 2 years, the remains lay on the eastern slope of the Crazy Mountains, sitting neatly beside him. It is the kind of detail that searchers who find it do not forget. Now this is where the case turns in a direction that experienced investigators have found genuinely difficult to categorize. The removal of footwear in wilderness situations is occasionally documented in cases of severe hypothermia. One of the paradoxical symptoms of late-stage hypothermia is a sensation of intense, overwhelming heat, sometimes called paradoxical undressing, in which a person whose core temperature is critically low begins to feel as if they are burning rather than freezing, and begins removing clothing accordingly. Boots, jackets, gloves. People have been recovered in winter wilderness environments with clothing removed, having experienced this in the final stages of hypothermic collapse. The neatly placed boots beside Aaron Hedges' remains are consistent with this interpretation and with this physiological process. They are also sitting there neatly on the eastern slope of the Crazy Mountains 2 years after he walked away from the hunting camp, one of the most quietly disturbing images this case has produced. Everything else about that place was defined by chaos. Terrain, distance, 2 years of exposure. The boots were not. But the boots do not explain how a former search and rescue team member with GPS equipment, who acknowledged a directional error in real time over radio, ended up 7 to 15 miles from his intended destination on the wrong side of a mountain range. They do not explain why crossing the sheer cliffs and rock-slide fields between the western and eastern sides of the Crazies, terrain that experienced wilderness, people approach with specific and deliberate caution. Left no recoverable trace that a 12-day search with military aircraft and 20 dog teams could locate. The GPS was with him. The radio call was made and heard. What happened in the hours between that last transmission and the eastern slope of the Crazy Mountains, where his boots were placed neatly beside him and everything else was nearly 2 years of silence, has never been reconstructed in any public account of this case. Aaron Hedges was found nearly 2 years after he walked away from the hunting camp on September 5th, 2014. The official cause of death remains undetermined. His boots are sitting neatly on the eastern side of the Crazy Mountains in terrain that the largest wilderness search in recent Montana memory never reached. And the central question: how an experienced search and rescue veteran with GPS equipment went from a corrected radio acknowledgement to an undetermined death 15 miles in the wrong direction remains entirely open. A former search and rescue veteran died in the mountains he knew best, miles from where the search was looking, with his boots placed neatly beside him, and no explanation the record can fully support for how he came to be there. The next case moves out of the wilderness entirely. A 23-year-old mother goes out to a Missoula bar on a June night in 2018, disappears from a surveillance camera in an alley, and has a phone that pings 14 miles away on a forested hill for 8 hours, while her family tries to report her missing and is told to come in person. June 15th, 2018. Downtown Missoula, Montana. The bar district is alive the way it gets on a Friday night in a college town. People moving between venues, music bleeding out of open doors. The particular energy of a city that is small enough to feel familiar and large enough to feel anonymous at the same time. The Badlander is a bar on West Front Street, a place that locals know and that draws the kind of crowd that comes out on a warm June evening to be around other people and let the week dissolve into something easier. It is not a dangerous place. It is not a place where anyone who walks in expects anything to go wrong on an ordinary summer night in a university city in western Montana. People go to the Badlander because it is a Friday, and the weather is warm, and there is nowhere they need to be immediately after. It is the kind of place that feels safe because it is familiar, because you know people there, because the street outside is lit and populated and ordinary. Jermaine Charlo is 23 years old. She is a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Reservation, originally from Dixon, Montana. She is a mother of 2 boys, ages 2 and 4, and by every account from her family and the people who knew her, she was a person who showed up fully in the world she occupied. Vibrant, creative, funny in a specific way that people who love someone remember long after everything else has faded. Her family describes her as a prolific social media poster who documented her life online with a consistency and frequency that meant her silence, when it came, was immediately and unmistakably alarming to every person who followed her. When Jermaine Charlo stopped posting, the people who knew her knew immediately that something was wrong. That silence was not a choice she would have made. That silence was not Jermaine. The absence of her voice online was, for the people who loved her, its own kind of alarm that went off the moment it started. She goes out on the night of June 15th with Michael DeFrance, her ex-boyfriend, the father of her 2 boys. This detail matters, and it matters from the very beginning, not as something that emerges later in the investigation. DeFrance has 2 documented domestic violence arrests on his record. The relationship between Jermaine and DeFrance was not a simple or clean one. And the people who knew Germaine understood what that relationship looked like from the outside and from within it. She goes out with him on a Friday night in June to the bar district in Missoula. Whatever her reasons for spending the evening with him, she makes the choice to go. Surveillance footage from the Badlander captures Germaine in the alley behind the bar just after midnight on June 16th. She and DeFrance walk eastbound down the alley together. That footage is the last known video of Germaine Charlot. It is also, critically, the last moment in this case where her location is established by objective, physical evidence, rather than by anyone's account of what happened next. Everything that comes after that camera frame is DeFrance's story. And DeFrance's story changes. The first version. He dropped her off at the Orange Street Food Farm, a convenience store in Missoula. That is where he says she got out of his vehicle, and that is the last place he saw her that night. The second version, told to different people at different points in the investigation. He dropped her off at Prince and South 5th Street West, 8 blocks away from the first location he named. 2 different drop-off points, 2 materially different versions of the same supposedly simple act of driving someone home after a night out. These are not subtle variations produced by a vague or imprecise memory of an unremarkable moment. They are 2 different addresses that cannot both be where the same event happened. DeFrance has never publicly reconciled them, and that contradiction has sat at the center of this investigation since it was first identified by detectives. Here is the critical detail, and it is the one that the investigation has returned to more than any other piece of evidence in this case. A search warrant executed on cell phone records places Germaine's phone active in the area of Avaro Hill from approximately 2 in the morning to 10 in the morning on June 16th. 8 hours from the middle of the night through the middle of the following morning. Avaro Hill is approximately 14 miles northwest of downtown Missoula, along Highway 93 within the Flathead Reservation. It is heavily forested terrain, steep hillside country that sits very close to the highway, but becomes very difficult to search once you move even a short distance off the road's surface into the brush. 14 miles from the bar, where she was last seen on camera, her phone active in that specific location for 8 consecutive hours, while her family had no idea where she was, and while Missoula was still hours away from receiving any official report of her disappearance. DeFrance lives near Avaro Hill. When investigators press on the phone, DeFrance's answers change the same way his drop-off story changed. First, he says Germaine had her phone with her when she left his vehicle. Then the story shifts. She left it in his truck by accident. Then, in a third version that investigators have documented and that Germaine's family has spoken about publicly, he says he threw the phone away at a rest stop while he was driving a trucking route. 3 separate accounts of what happened to a single phone. A phone that cell data places near his residence for 8 consecutive hours in the middle of the night after she was last seen. The phone has never been found by investigators. It has been years. It has never been found. Now this is where the institutional failure compounds what is already a deeply alarming picture. Germaine's family attempts to report her missing on June 17th, the day after she was last captured on camera in that alley. They are told that a missing persons report cannot be filed by phone and must be made in person at the department. The family has to physically drive to Missoula to make the report. By the time the official report is filed, it is June 20th, 4 full days after the last camera image of Germaine walking down an alley behind the Badlander at midnight. 4 full days after her phone went silent near Avaro Hill. The first detective assigned to the case then takes time off. Detective Guy Baker is not formally assigned as the primary investigator until June 26th. 11 days after Jermaine Charlo disappeared from that alley, the case finally has a continuously assigned primary detective. Those 11 days represent the most critical window in any missing persons investigation. Surveillance footage that has not yet been overwritten. Physical evidence that has not yet been disturbed by weather or time or human activity. Witnesses whose memories are as sharp and as accessible as they will ever be. 11 days passed before a primary detective was actively and continuously working this case. Jermaine's family has never accepted any explanation for that gap, and the Missoula Police Department has never offered one that holds up against the documented timeline. The searches of Avaro Hill that follow over the subsequent months and years are extensive and produce nothing conclusive. The terrain along Highway 93 on Avaro Hill is dense forested hillside, thick brush, steep slopes, difficult navigation even for experienced searchers working with trained dogs. Cadaver dogs are deployed repeatedly across multiple search operations. They alert on specific points in the terrain near the highway corridor. The University of Montana's Forensic Anthropology Department is called in to assist with analyzing what the dogs are responding to. Animal bones are scattered through the brush in quantities that complicate the forensic picture significantly. This terrain has bones throughout it, and distinguishing human remains from animal remains in that volume of material requires sustained forensic effort across multiple visits. Human remains have not been located on Avaro Hill despite repeated multi-agency efforts spanning years. As of the Cold Justice Season 8 finale, which aired in November 2025, Michael DeFrance is described on record by investigators as the prime suspect in Jermaine's disappearance. He has declined to speak with investigators without an attorney present. No arrest has been made, no charges have been filed. The case is active and open, with Detective Baker still working it and still unable to say publicly that he has assembled everything a prosecution would require to go forward. Baker has described the evidence as pointing in a specific direction while acknowledging that not every piece is in place. He has been photographed standing in the thick vegetation on Avaro Hill, surrounded by scattered animal bones, in the specific terrain where cadaver dogs have alerted and human remains have not been found. He talks about what he believes happened and why he cannot yet prove it to the standard that a courtroom demands. That image, a detective standing in terrain he believes holds the answer, surrounded by evidence he has not yet been able to read in full, has become the defining image of where this case has been sitting for 7 years. The broader context of this case cannot be separated from what happened to Jermaine Charlo and should not be presented as if it can. Native Americans make up approximately 6% of Montana's population and account for approximately 26% of the state's active missing persons cases. That disparity is documented, and it is not accidental. It reflects jurisdictional complexity between tribal, state, and federal law enforcement. Chronic underfunding of tribal law enforcement agencies, and the reporting delays and institutional gaps that recur across case after case in the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people, that Jermaine's disappearance became a national symbol of. A billboard with her face on it still stands on Highway 93, staring north toward the tree line at Avaro Hill, toward the stretch of forested hillside where her phone last registered before 8 hours of activity and then permanent silence. Her 2 boys are older now. The billboard is still there. Jermaine Charlo's phone sat active near Avaro Hill for 8 hours on the night she disappeared, 14 miles from the bar where she was last seen on camera, near the residence of a man whose account of the evening has produced 3 stories about a phone and 2 different addresses for a drop-off that can only have happened at one location. No arrest, no remains, no closure for a family that had to drive to Missoula to file a report because they were told they could not do it by phone. 11 days between her disappearance and the assignment of a primary detective, and no amount of work since has returned what was lost inside them. A woman's phone sat silent on Avaro Hill for 8 hours, and no one has answered for it yet. The next case moves north to the Blackfeet Reservation, where a 3-year-old girl disappears from a riverbank at dusk. Footprints lead to the water's edge. One small boot is found in the current, and the river gives back nothing else. April 22nd, 2021. Joe Show East Road, off United States Highway 89. Blackfeet Indian Reservation, Montana. Southeast of Browning, near the Two Medicine River. It is early evening, approximately 7 in the evening, and the light on the Rocky Mountain front is doing what it does in late April on the eastern face of the Rockies, falling fast and going orange at the edges before the cold moves in off the plains. This is reservation land, and it is beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when they have not been softened for visitors. Dramatic, exposed, the mountains rising immediately to the west, and the river cutting through the land below them in swift, cold current, fed by snowmelt that has been building in the high country since November. The Two Medicine River in April is not gentle water. The snowpack from the mountains above is coming down in volume, and the river carries that weight in its speed and its temperature, staying cold enough to be dangerous to anyone who enters it without preparation and without the physical capacity to fight what the current does when it has this much force behind it. Wildlife moves through this corridor. Bears, mountain lions, coyotes, the kinds of animals that register a small child on a riverbank as a fact of the environment. And the searchers who come here later will note consistently that the brush along the riverbank is dense. The terrain is uneven, and this land gives nothing up easily to people who do not know how to read it. The Rocky Mountain front to the west catches the last of the light. The river runs cold and indifferent below. Arden Pepion is 3 years old. Her family calls her Artie. Her parents, Arbana and Aaron Pepion, describe her as a little girl with a big voice and a huge personality. The kind of 3-year-old who fills a room not because she is disruptive, but because she is fully, specifically, unmistakably herself in every moment she occupies. She has 2 siblings. She has a grandmother's house she knows well. She has the particular energy of a very small child who is entirely at home in the world immediately around her. Her family, the land, the reservation she was born into, and that she has no reason yet to understand as anything but home. On April 22nd, she is wearing a purple unicorn jacket over a gray sweater, black leggings, and black and green boots. She's at the riverbank on Joe Show East Road under the supervision of her uncle, Hahax Viel, on an April evening with the light going fast and the river running fast below. At approximately 7 in the evening, Arden is last seen. The disappearance is not reported to Blackfeet law enforcement services until approximately midnight, a gap of 5 to 6 hours between when she was last seen and when the first official report is filed. Investigators have confirmed that gap. 5 to 6 hours. In that window, whatever happened on that riverbank and whatever evidence might have anchored the scene more precisely to a specific sequence of events had already had hours to change, to be disturbed, to be lost to the current or the dark or the wildlife that moves through this country after sundown. The critical search window. The hours when physical evidence is freshest. when scent trails are strongest, when the scene is most likely to yield the information it holds, was already substantially gone by the time official responders were notified that a 3-year-old was missing from that riverbank. Here is the critical detail. When investigators reach the scene, they find footprints, small footprints, leading toward the Two Medicine River. The footprints go to the water's edge. They stop at the bank. 3 days later, on April 25th, divers working the river locate one of Arden's boots in the current. One boot, not both, one. In a river that is cold and fast and swollen with April snow melt, running through the eastern face of the Rocky Mountains in country that does not easily give back what it takes. The boot is recovered. Arden is not. This is where the case becomes something that Arden's family has never been able to accept as a complete or sufficient accounting of what happened on that riverbank. The search that follows is extraordinary in scale for a case involving a missing child from a reservation community that has historically had to fight for investigative resources commensurate with the cases it generates. The National Guard is deployed. Multi-agency coordination brings in Border Patrol, the Glacier, Pondera, and Toole County Sheriff's Offices, the FBI, Flathead County Dive, and K-9 teams, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs Missing and Murdered Unit. Cadaver dogs are brought in and worked across the terrain near the river. They alert consistently on a specific point near the riverbank. The same point across multiple search passes, across multiple different certified teams working independently of each other. Divers go into the Two Medicine River at that location in response to the alerts. They find nothing. The dogs keep hitting the same point. The divers keep going in. Human remains are not recovered. The search is scaled back on May 1st, less than 2 weeks after Arden disappeared, with the river having produced only one boot and the terrain having produced only footprints that end at the water's edge. Arden's family's response to the search conclusion is documented and direct. Her paternal grandmother speaks publicly about what does not add up from where she stands. If investigators found the boot in the river, she says, why have they not found her body? Where is she? Did she really go into the river? These are not rhetorical questions from a family in grief reaching for something to hold. They are questions about the physical logic of the evidence as it has been presented. A boot in a river is evidence of something entering the water. It is not a complete accounting of what followed that entry. And the Two Medicine River, which has a documented pattern of surface recovery when objects and remains enter it, has not completed that accounting in the 4 years since April 22nd, 2021. The cadaver dog alerts are the specific detail that has never been satisfactorily resolved in any public reporting of this case. Dogs trained and certified to detect human remains alert on the same point near the riverbank, across multiple operations conducted by different teams at different times and across different seasons. Each time divers go into the water at that location in response to those consistent alerts, they find nothing recoverable. The alerts are consistent. The recovery is absent. In forensic terms, a repeated cadaver dog alert without a corresponding physical find can mean several things. Residual scent from a source that has moved downstream, underwater geography that concentrates scent without trapping remains, or material below the surface that divers have not been able to locate in the visibility and current conditions specific to that stretch of river. None of those explanations fully closes the gap between what the dogs are detecting and what the divers cannot find. The gap remains open and unresolved, and it has been open and unresolved for 4 years. Uncle Ha Hax VL, who was supervising Arden at the riverbank at the time she disappeared, later pleaded guilty to negligent endangerment. He received a 9-month suspended sentence. No one has been charged with anything beyond that in connection with Arden's disappearance. The legal outcome represents the entirety of what the formal legal process has concluded about what happened on Joe Show East Road on the evening of April 22nd, 2021. 1 guilty plea to a negligence charge, 1 suspended sentence, and a case file that remains open with no further charges and no located remains. In 2022, the Bureau of Indian Affairs Missing and Murdered Unit formally took over the case. Their public statement on the transition is notable for what it declines to explain. They state that legal circumstances exist that prevent them from discussing case management publicly. Not investigative circumstances, not resource constraints, not jurisdictional complexity between agencies. Legal circumstances. That language, applied to a case involving a missing 3-year-old from a reservation community, has never been publicly unpacked into anything more specific. It sits in the public record as a phrase that raises more questions than it answers and has been left there without further elaboration. What makes the context of Arden's disappearance particularly stark is the timing relative to the community around her. She vanished on April 22nd, 2021. 5 days later, a 26-year-old man named Leo Wagner also disappeared from the Blackfeet Reservation. 2 people gone from the same small community within a single week. The proximity of those 2 disappearances in time and geography has never been formally connected by investigators in any public statement. It has not been lost on the people who live there and who understand what a week like that does to a small community already carrying the weight of the missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis. Private investigative teams hired by Arden's family have returned to the riverbank site on multiple occasions across multiple seasons. Cadaver dogs have been brought back and have returned to the same alerts near the same point near the river. Divers have gone in again in response. The Two Medicine River has produced nothing beyond the single boot recovered on April the 25th, 2021. The family continues to ask the question the evidence has not answered. If the river took her, why is there only 1 boot and no body from a waterway with documented recovery patterns? And if something other than the river accounts for what happened, what does the boot mean? And where is the rest of Arden? On September 5th, 2021, volunteers came to search for Arden Papillon. They worked from 9 in the morning to 6 in the evening, moving through the terrain around the Two Medicine River as completely as volunteer searchers can cover difficult reservation land in a day. They found nothing. September 5th was Arden's 4th birthday. She would have turned 4 years old that day. The people who came to search knew that when they arrived in the morning, and they searched anyway, working from first light until the light faded on the Rocky Mountain front. On the day that should have been a birthday celebration and was instead another full day of looking for a little girl that the reservation and the river have not given back. The Bureau of Indian Affairs investigation remains open. The legal circumstances preventing public discussion of case management have never been explained. The cadaver dog alerts near the riverbank have not been resolved by any physical recovery. The Two Medicine River has given back 1 boot and nothing else. And Arden Papillon, 3 years old, purple unicorn jacket, black and green boots, big voice and huge personality. Last seen at dusk on an April evening on the Blackfeet Reservation has not been found. A 3-year-old birthday search found nothing. The next case moves to Yellowstone National Park, where a 13-year-old Boy Scout is knocked into the river in front of 50 people on the bank. is seen floating head above water toward downstream whitewater, and two shoes are found miles apart on different days. The Yellowstone River gives back nothing else. June 24th, 2005. Yellowstone National Park, 6 miles north of Gardner, Montana, along the northern corridor of the park where the Yellowstone River runs cold and fast through a landscape that looks nothing like the geothermal features tourists associate with the park interior. Up here, the terrain is more raw. Canyon walls, river bends, cottonwood and sage on the banks. Water that moves with a purpose that has nothing to do with the people standing next to it. The park in this northern section feels less like a managed destination and more like what it actually is underneath all the infrastructure. A landscape operating on its own schedule, indifferent to the roads and the campgrounds and the ranger stations that exist alongside it. The Yellowstone River in late June is carrying snowmelt from the high country that feeds it. And that snowmelt has been coming down for weeks, swelling the river well past its low water banks and pushing the current into velocity ranges that change what the river is capable of doing to a person who enters it. The river at this time of year and at this water level has a physical authority that is not visible from the bank in the way that ocean surf is visible. The river looks like a river, and it is. But what it is doing to anything submerged in it does not show from the outside. The incident commander who arrives on scene that evening, Tim Reed, will later describe the water conditions in terms that are specific and unambiguous. Unswimmable. That is the word he uses in his documentation. Not difficult, not cold, not challenging. Unswimmable. That is the precise word the person in charge of the search operation chooses to describe the river that a 13-year-old boy is about to be knocked into at approximately 6:30 in the evening in front of 3 adults and 5 other children in a camping area 6 miles north of Gardner. Luke Sandberg is 13 years old, from Helena, Montana. He has just finished 7th grade. He is a math kid, the kind of student who finds the patterns in numbers before other students have figured out what the problem is asking, the kind of quiet competence in a specific domain that marks someone early as a person who will be good at things that matter to them. He loves hunting and fishing with his dad, the kind of outdoors engagement that is practical and specific and belongs to a relationship built on shared time in particular places, on early mornings, on the patience that fishing and hunting require from a kid who actually has it rather than pretends to. He is a big brother who holds his younger sister's hand when they cross the street, a detail his family carries, and that says something specific about who he was in the world when nobody was asking him to be anything in particular. His elementary school counselor, asked about him after he disappears, describes him as a sweet, little, wonderful kid. He is 13 years old and has just finished 7th grade, and he is on a Boy Scout camping trip in the northern section of Yellowstone National Park on a Friday evening in June, 6 miles from Gardner. At a campsite alongside a river, the incident commander will document as unswimmable. The Boy Scout troop is 6 scouts and 3 adults. At approximately 6:30 in the evening, the boys are pushing logs into the Yellowstone River from the bank. This is the activity that is happening along the bank of an unswimmable river in Yellowstone National Park, with 3 supervising adults present and 6 scouts. The logs go in, and the current takes them, and the boys watch them go. The Yellowstone River in late June at this location runs through sections of whitewater downstream from the camping area. Downstream means where the logs go, and where the logs go is where the river has already told you what it does with things it gets. The water temperature is approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit. No one in the group is wearing water gear appropriate to the conditions. Luke Sandberg is in street clothes, the clothes a kid puts on for a day at a campsite, not for contact with 50-degree river water that an incident commander will classify as unswimmable. A log clips his legs. The current does the rest. Luke goes into the river. He is seen after entry. That detail matters and needs to be held clearly because it defines the specific shape of this case. Luke Sandberg is visible in the Yellowstone River after he enters the water. Witnesses on the bank, the scouts, the adults, see him floating with his head above the surface, moving downstream toward the section of white water below the camping area. He is alive and visible in the water as he moves toward the rapids. And then the river takes him around a bend, or into the white water, or under something the current controls, and that is the last confirmed visual that anyone has of Luke Sandberg. A 13-year-old boy, head above the surface, moving. Downstream in the Yellowstone River in Yellowstone National Park, in front of witnesses who are standing on the bank watching it happen, and who cannot do anything to stop what the river has already decided. This is where it stops being normal and becomes the kind of loss that does not resolve cleanly on any timeline. The search that follows is one of the most intensive river search operations in recent Yellowstone history. A 14-mile section of the river is designated as the Search Corridor. From Knowles Falls downstream to the Corwin Springs Bridge. 50 park personnel are deployed along the banks. More than 100 additional volunteers arrive to help. Friends, family, church members from Helena, who drove down because a 13-year-old boy is missing from a river. And that is sufficient reason to get in the car and come. Ground teams work the banks of the 14-mile corridor on foot. Aerial assets cover the water from above. Kayakers move through sections that require watercraft to access properly. 24 observation posts are established at points along the corridor and staffed continuously, with people watching the river surface for any sign of Luke coming through. On Saturday, June 25th, the day after Luke entered the river, one of his tennis shoes is found approximately 5 miles downstream from the camping area. 5 miles of river in a single day. On Sunday, June 26th, the second tennis shoe is located, not at the same point as the first, at a different location downstream. Retrieved on a different day. 2 shoes, 2 locations, 2 days. The river moved them separately, at different rates, at different points in the search period, which tells you something about how the current distributes what it carries. Not uniformly, not in a single delivery to a single location, but according to the specific hydraulics of that corridor and whatever the underwater geography of the riverbed does to objects moving through it at late June water levels. Here is the critical detail that defines this case against the backdrop of everything else. 150 people on the banks of a 14-mile search corridor. Aerial coverage overhead. Kayakers in the water. 24 continuously staffed observation posts watching the surface. And the river produces 2 tennis shoes and nothing else. In a 14-mile section of the Yellowstone River, searched by that volume of resources over multiple days, the only physical evidence of Luke Sandberg the river gave back was footwear found miles apart on consecutive days. No clothing, no other material, nothing that would allow investigators to narrow where in the corridor he came to rest or where the underwater architecture of the riverbed holds him. By Sunday evening, June 26th, Luke's family has reached the place that families in this situation are sometimes pushed to by the weight of evidence that keeps not coming. His aunt, Jenna Lay, speaks to rescue workers that evening and tells them that the family has come to accept that they will not find Luke alive. That sentence spoken on a Sunday evening on the bank of the Yellowstone River, is not surrender. It is what happens when 150 people have covered 14 miles of river over 2 days, and the water has given back only shoes. The family reaches the place the evidence pushes them toward, and they say it out loud because saying it is what remains to do. Now here is what does not make sense within the framework of a straightforward drowning on a river with known hydraulic complexity. Luke was visible after entry. He was head above water and moving downstream when witnesses last had eyes on him, which means he was not immediately incapacitated by cold water shock at the moment he entered the river. 50-degree water causes progressive incapacitation. Cold shock, the physiological cascade that follows submersion, the loss of muscular control that arrives on timelines that depend on the individual and the conditions. But the visible distance Luke covered between where he went in and where witnesses lost sight of him suggests he survived the immediate entry and moved downstream while still at the surface. He was seen. He was moving. He was there. And then he was not. River hydraulics create what safety professionals call hydraulic traps, locations where the underwater geography of the riverbed, combined with the force and direction of the current at a given water level, can hold submerged material in place for extended periods without that material ever surfacing. Objects enter a river above a hydraulic trap and can become lodged in the underwater architecture and remain there regardless of what is happening at the surface above. The Yellowstone River in the northern section of the park has the geological complexity and the late June water volume to produce these conditions at multiple points across a 14-mile corridor. The 2 shoes found at different locations on different days suggest the current was actively moving material from the entry zone downstream during the search period. The absence of Luke's body from the entirety of that corridor suggests the river moved him to a location that bank level and aerial searching across 14 miles could not reach. Luke Sandberg's case remains open on Montana's missing persons database. His body has never been recovered. The Yellowstone River holds the answer to where he is, and in 20 years has not offered it. His family accepted on a Sunday evening in June 2005 what the evidence was telling them. The river confirmed that acceptance by giving back only shoes and then falling permanently silent on everything else. And the adults who were present on the bank when 6 scouts were pushing logs into an unswimmable river have never been held formally responsible for what happened to Luke Sandberg that evening in Yellowstone National Park. 2 tennis shoes, a 14-mile corridor, 150 people on the banks, a 13-year-old boy from Helena that the Yellowstone River has not returned in 20 years. The final case is next, and it happens in broad daylight on one of the most walked trails in America, a trail with 3 million annual visitors. And the only physical evidence ever found is a pair of sunglasses. July 22nd, 2020. Glacier National Park, Montana. The Highline Trail. This is not a fringe case, not a remote backcountry route that requires special permits and days of approach through unmapped wilderness. The Highline Trail is one of the most famous day hikes in America. It runs along the Garden Wall above Logan Pass, with the cliff face rising on one side and views that extend for miles across the park to the west. The kind of views that end up on magazine covers and in travel articles about the places you should see before you die. The kind of views that have made this trail one of the defining experiences of Glacier National Park for generations of summer visitors. 3 million people visit Glacier every year. In the summer months, the Highline Trail is walked by thousands of hikers who drive up to Logan Pass, step out of their cars, and begin moving along a path that is well marked, well traveled, and spectacular in a way that even very good photographs cannot fully convey. It is not the kind of trail where people disappear. It is not the kind of trail where a disappearance should be possible on a summer day, when thousands of people are moving through the same landscape at the same time, in both directions, in the full light of a July afternoon in one of the most visited national parks in the United States. And yet, on July 22nd, 2020, Barry Tragan sets out on the Highline Trail and does not come back. And the only physical evidence ever located in connection with his disappearance is a pair of sunglasses. Barry Tragan is a day hiker in Glacier National Park. The public record on his personal background is more limited than some of the other cases in this video. His age at the time of his disappearance is not confirmed in available public sourcing. And this account notes that gap rather than filling it with unverified detail. What is confirmed is this. He set out for a day hike on the Highline Trail on July 22nd, 2020. He was not attempting a technical backcountry route or a multi-day expedition requiring wilderness permits. He was not in the off-season like Patrick Whalen. He was not in a remote range far from any trail like Aaron Hedges. He was doing what thousands of people do in Glacier every summer, hiking one of the park's signature trails on a day when the park was open, the trail was clear, and visitors were using it in the ordinary volume of a summer day. He was a day hiker on a famous trail in a busy national park, and he did not come back from it. That is the premise of this case. And it is a premise that has never been satisfactorily resolved. This is where the case distinguishes itself from the 9 that preceded it. And the distinction is the setting. A remote campground in the Elkhorn Mountains, a country road outside Ronan, a desolate 2-lane highway in eastern Montana, a residential alley in Great Falls on a Tuesday morning, a backcountry camp in Glacier in November when the park was nearly empty, a deep hunting range in the Crazy Mountains, a Missoula bar district on a Friday night, a reservation riverbank at dusk, the Yellowstone River at a campsite 6 miles from the nearest town. Those are the settings of the previous 9 cases, remote or rural, or isolated in one way or another. Settings where the absence of witnesses has context and explanation built into the geography. Barry Tragan disappears from the Highline Trail in Glacier National Park on a summer day in July, on a trail that 3 million people visit the park to walk every year. The density of human presence that should make a disappearance there impossible is exactly what makes the absence of any witness account so striking and so difficult to set aside. No one comes forward to report seeing anything meaningful. Not on the Highline Trail on July 22nd. Not at Logan Pass, which serves as the trailhead and is one of the busiest points in the entire park during summer. A parking area full of cars, rangers managing the crowd, hundreds of people starting and finishing hikes at any given moment in peak season. Not at any point along the route that thousands of summer visitors were walking that day in both directions. In a case from a remote November backcountry, the absence of witnesses is expected because the absence of people explains it. In a case from the Highline Trail on a summer day in Glacier National Park, the absence of anyone who saw anything actionable is its own separate impossibility, layered on top of the physical one. Here is the critical detail. The only physical evidence ever found in connection with Barry Tragan's disappearance is a pair of sunglasses. A pair of sunglasses believed to be his, located during the search of the Highline Trail area. That is the entirety of the physical record. Not a piece of clothing left at a specific identifiable point. not gear indicating a direction of travel, not a secondary item that narrows the geography of what happened to him. A pair of sunglasses on one of the most walked trails in America, on a summer day in a park with 3 million annual visitors. That is everything the physical environment gave back. Glacier Chief Ranger Paul Austin speaks about the case and chooses his words with the particular care that experienced law enforcement uses when describing a situation that does not conform to expected patterns. He states that investigators know Troggin descended from the Highline Trail area, which establishes a directional understanding of at least one phase of his movement on that day. But that, after that point, the trail of evidence runs out. There is not enough, in Austin's documented assessment, to lead investigators in a specific direction from the Highline descent. A pair of sunglasses and a directional inference. That is what July 22, 2020 produced from one of the most populated hiking corridors in America. The terrain of the Highline Trail explains something and does not explain everything. The trail runs along the garden wall, with the cliff face rising on one side and the drop falling away on the other. The edge of the Highline is not a gentle transition from trail to meadow. It is a trail cut along a dramatic geological feature, with the fall below it significant enough that the trail itself has a safety cable bolted into the cliff face at its narrowest and most exposed sections for hikers who need something to hold on to. If a hiker leaves the trail, whether through a fall, a medical event, disorientation, or any of the mechanisms that move a person from the surface of a trail to the terrain adjacent to it, the landscape immediately off the Highline is extremely difficult to access and to search. Cliffs, steep vegetation-covered slopes, terrain that drops away from the trail edge toward valleys below that are themselves remote and demanding. Glacier has a character, in this and in other sections, that makes recovery of someone who has gone off a trail not just difficult, but in certain circumstances, practically impossible in the near term, regardless of the resources deployed. Paul Austin says something about this case that stays with you. He says he has never seen terrain like this. Austin is Glacier's chief ranger, a person who knows this park at a depth that most visitors will never approach, who has worked searches in glacier terrain across years of tenure in that role, who understands what this landscape does to people and to search operations from direct experience across many cases. When the chief ranger of Glacier National Park says he has never seen terrain like what the area around the Highline presents to search and recovery operations, he is not speaking loosely or for rhetorical effect. He is describing a specific and genuine characteristic of this landscape. A park that is capable of absorbing a person completely in terrain adjacent to one of its most heavily used summer trails. The aerial assets deployed in the search cover the Highline corridor and the terrain adjacent to it. Ground searchers work what is accessible in a landscape that limits access in the ways Austin describes. The park holds Troggin's case open, alongside another concurrent active disappearance, a hiker named Sinclair, in the same filing period. Glacier National Park is holding multiple unresolved missing persons simultaneously. That fact, that one of the most heavily visited national parks in the United States has concurrent, unresolved disappearances, that its search capabilities cannot close even in peak season, has not received the sustained public attention it seems to warrant. Each case is filed and worked individually. But together, Troggin and Sinclair represent a pattern of glacier terrain producing outcomes that the available evidence cannot explain and that the available search resources cannot resolve. The active search is scaled back. The case remains technically open as of the most recent publicly available reporting. The sunglasses have not led to a location. The directional inference about descent from the Highline Trail area has not been followed to a physical outcome. The Chief Ranger's observation about the terrain stands as the most precise available description of why a summer trail in Glacier National Park, on a day when thousands of people are walking it, can produce a disappearance that the physical evidence cannot account for and that the most experienced people in the park cannot fully explain. Consider what the sunglasses represent as a physical record. One pair of sunglasses on one of the most walked trails in America, not at a remote location where a single item is an unusual and significant find. On the Highline Trail, a trail where objects are dropped and found and turned into ranger stations with some regularity because thousands of people walk it every summer day, and things fall from pockets and get left on rocks at scenic overlooks. One pair of sunglasses is the entirety of what Barry Tragan left behind on a summer day in 2020 in Glacier National Park. And that single item has not been enough to answer any of the questions his disappearance raises about where he went after descending from the trail area, or what happened to him when he got there. Barry Tragan has not been found. His case is open. The Highline Trail has 3 million visitors a year, and none of them who were there on July 22, 2020, have come forward with anything that has moved this case into a conclusion. The sunglasses sit in the evidence record as the only physical marker of a man who was on one of the most populated hiking corridors in America, and then was simply not. 10 cases, 10 people, 10 corners of a state with 147,000 square miles and more space than it will ever have answers. What comes next is the last thing left to do, which is to look at all 10 at once, stand back from them and say what Montana has made of them and what it has not. Pull back to the aerial view that opened this video. Montana from above. The sky bigger than anywhere else in America. The highways that run for miles without towns. The mountains that absorb people whole. The same image that started this. But now there are 10 red pins on the map, spread across the entire state. Not clustered in one dangerous corridor, not concentrated in one season or one type of terrain or one demographic or one kind of person. They are everywhere, and the fact that they are everywhere is itself something that takes time to fully absorb. A campground in the Elkhorn Mountains, where a 4-year-old sat by a beaver dam and did not come back. A small-town bakery route in the Mission Valley, where a priest walked out one evening and left only blood behind. A 2-lane highway cutting through the eastern Montana flatlands, where a woman climbed a fence and walked away from a car crash into the dark. A residential alley in Great Falls on a Tuesday morning in February, where a 10-year-old in a blue football jersey was 1 block from school. A backcountry wilderness in November Glacier when the trails were icing over and almost everyone else had gone home. A hunting range in the Crazy Mountains where a former search and rescue veteran ended up 15 miles from where anyone was looking for him. A bar district in Missoula on a Friday night in June where a phone pinged 14 miles away for 8 hours and no one answered for it. A reservation riverbank on the Rocky Mountain front at dusk where footprints go to the water edge and stop. The Yellowstone River in a camping area 6 miles north of Gardner where a boy was visible head above water and then was not. The most walked trail in Glacier National Park on a summer afternoon with thousands of people nearby where a pair of sunglasses is the only evidence left. 10 settings, 10 people, 10 cases that have stayed open across timelines stretching from 1983 to 2021. Nearly 4 decades of Montana producing disappearances that its investigative systems, its search capabilities, and its terrain have collectively failed to close. If you look at the pins on that map, what you notice first is not a pattern of geography. What you notice is the absence of a pattern. The pins do not cluster around a single dangerous corridor or a single season or a single kind of place. They are distributed across 147,000 square miles of a state that turns out to have a specific and persistent relationship with not knowing, with producing disappearances that leave investigators and families holding open files that time does not close and terrain does not clarify. Each case, taken alone, looks like an outlier. Taken together, they look like a pattern. Not a pattern of predators or of terrain type or of season, but a pattern of gaps. Gaps between the last confirmed location and the first absence of evidence. Gaps between the disappearance and the assignment of a primary detective. Gaps between the search corridor and the location where remains are eventually found. Montana produces the gaps. The gaps stay open. That is what the map of 10 red pins is actually showing you. Here is what these 10 cases have in common when you look at them together rather than one at a time. In every one of them, there is a last confirmed location. A beaver dam seen by other children minutes before she was gone. An alley behind a Missoula bar captured on surveillance footage just after midnight. A fence at the side of a highway that a woman climbed after a crash and never came back from. A street corner 1 block from Whittier Elementary. A highway junction at the eastern edge of Glacier where a vehicle sat without its owner. In every case, the person is there, confirmed, located, documented. And then the person is not there. And the physical distance between those two conditions is shorter than any reasonable analysis of the circumstances should allow. The gap between the last confirmed location and the total absence is smaller than the terrain or the circumstances should produce. And in each case, that gap has remained unclosed across years, across decades, across generations of family members who have aged while the case file has not moved. Here is what else these 10 cases share. In every case involving a formal investigation, there are institutional failures that compound the disappearance itself and extend the gap. 11 days before a primary detective is assigned to Jermaine Charlo, 4 days between her disappearance and an official report being filed, because her family was told they had to come in person. A 5 to 6 hour delay in reporting Arden Papillon missing, destroying the most critical early search window in a case involving a 3-year-old near a fast April river. A mother's faith causing murder charges against the man most investigators believe killed her son to be dropped before they were ever filed. A 12-day search for Aaron Hedges concentrated on the wrong side of a mountain range because land ownership delayed access to the terrain where his remains were eventually found nearly 2 years later. The Father Kerrigan case featured on one of the most watched true crime programs in television history, generating millions of viewers and 0 actionable leads. A 1983 campground case generating 4 boxes of files and an anonymous caller who used Madison, Wisconsin payphones and disappeared from the record the moment investigators identified the booths. None of these failures are the result of individual investigators not caring. They are systemic, the accumulated result of underfunded agencies, jurisdictional complexity between tribal, state, and federal law enforcement. The specific and documented weight of the missing and murdered Indigenous people crisis that runs through the Jermaine Charlo and Arden Papillon cases with particular force. And the basic arithmetic of trying to investigate disappearances across 147,000 square miles with resources that are rarely adequate to the landscape they are being asked to cover. Here is what the terrain does to all of it, because the terrain is not passive in these cases. Montana is not a background. Montana is an active participant. dense elkhorn forest that loses a tracking dog scent within a short distance from a campground full of families on a Saturday afternoon. The crazy mountains producing remains 7 to 15 miles from where a 12-day search was concentrated, in terrain the operation could not legally access during the critical window. Glaciers swallowing Patrick Whalen so completely that his backcountry camp sat undisturbed for 7 months through a Montana winter before a ranger found it. And then swallowing Barry Tragan on a summer afternoon on the most walked trail in the park, in the presence of thousands of nearby visitors, without producing a single witness account of what happened after he descended from the trail area. The Two Medicine River giving back 1 boot, the Yellowstone River giving back 2 shoes miles apart on different days, and nothing else from a 14-mile corridor worked by 150 people. The Avaro Hill Forest generating cadaver dog alerts across multiple search operations that divers cannot resolve because the brush is too dense and the terrain too steep, and the scattered animal remains too numerous for clean forensic differentiation. In case after case, the landscape is not simply an obstacle to resolution. The landscape becomes the resolution, or the permanent non-resolution. Montana terrain is why these cases stay open. It is why they were hard to work in the first place, and it is why they will remain hard in the years to come. What is striking when you have spent time inside all 10 of these cases is how different the missing people are from each other. A 4-year-old at a family picnic, a Catholic priest on a new assignment, a ranch hand driving in the wrong direction under stress, a 10-year-old who was the best drawer in his class, an experienced nurse with thousands of wilderness miles, a former search and rescue veteran with pre-positioned supply caches, a 23-year-old mother who posted about everything, a 3-year-old in a purple unicorn jacket, a 13-year-old who held his sister's hand crossing streets, a summer day hiker on a famous trail. They share no profile, no geography, no demographic or background or circumstance that would predict this outcome for all of them. What they share is Montana, and what Montana does to a case when investigation runs into terrain that does not cooperate, resources that are not sufficient, and time that keeps moving while the file does not. What these 10 cases also reveal is who bears the weight of Montana's not knowing most heavily. Nylene Marshall's mother was murdered in Mexico 12 years after her daughter vanished from that campground. One tragedy nested inside another with no resolution for either. Zachary Ramsey's mother's love, so profound it could not accept the most likely conclusion, was the reason murder charges against the man most investigators believe killed her son were never filed. Jermaine Charlot's family had to physically drive to a police department to file a report because the phone was not sufficient. Arden Pepion's grandmother asks publicly, on camera, if they found the boot, why haven't they found her? These are the people who carry the open cases forward, not the investigators, not the databases, not the case files sitting in official systems. The families carry them to the media and to private investigators and to volunteer search parties on birthdays and to billboards on Highway 93 that stare north toward Avaro Hill. They carry them because no one and nothing else will. The pins on the map do not move. They are fixed at their locations: a campground, a bakery road, a highway, an alley, a backcountry camp, a mountain slope, a bar alley, a riverbank, a river, a famous trail. They mark where someone was last confirmed to be present. And they have been there since 1983, 1984, 1989, 1996, 2000, 2005, 2014, 2018, 2020, and 2021. They will be there after this video ends. The cases will still be open. The families will still be carrying them. The terrain will still be doing what Montana terrain does, holding its information the way that mountains and rivers and dense forests and remote highways hold things, which is indefinitely, without apology, and without any particular concern for what human beings need from it. In Montana, where 147,000 square miles absorbs people, where terrain complicates everything, where cases sit in filing boxes for 40 years, and the landscape keeps no records of what it takes. The disappearing is not the mystery. The disappearing happens. It happens in campgrounds and alleys, and on famous trails, and in rivers, and in mountain ranges, and on country roads outside small towns, where the bakery closes at a reasonable hour, and the priest walks out into the evening and does not come back. The mystery is the not knowing. The mystery is the space between where someone was and where they should have been, and the 147,000 square miles of Montana that exists between those 2 points and offers no accounting of what happened inside it. Montana has more space than answers. It always has. If this video got into your head the way these cases got into ours, subscribe. Every case on this channel is researched to the same standard. New ones every week.